So what is a carbon credit? The definition of a carbon credit is that it's a financial instrument that is generated when 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent avoidance, removal, or reduction is certified. And it's that certification piece that's quite important. So trees remove carbon from the atmosphere every day, but just because there's a forest in your city doesn't mean that it's generating carbon credits. It's the certification process that generates this financial instrument that can be traded and used to support corporations' net zero claims. The reason that it's carbon dioxide equivalent is that sometimes it's not carbon dioxide that's being captured or stored. There are other greenhouse gases such as methane that can be removed from the atmosphere and credits can be generated. And in order to allow a single tradable instrument, that's then converted into carbon dioxide equivalent. So methane has, I think, 64 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. So every ton of methane that's captured generates 64 carbon dioxide equivalent certificates. So that's just something to remember when you're looking at the credits generated by different projects. So there's 3 types of carbon credits. Avoidance are credits that are generated for every ton of emissions that a project is able to verify. The most commonly traded instrument is a RED plus, so reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation plus sustainable management of forests and conservation enhancements of forest carbon stocks, most commonly referred to as REDD plus. These account for about 99% of avoidance credits, which themselves in 2023 was 75% of the total voluntary credit market. So most voluntary carbon credits that you buy today on the markets are these REDD plus credits. And what that means is that if a project is able to demonstrate that by protecting an area of forest or by improving the way that the forest is managed or preventing deforestation, sequesters a ton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they're then able to generate and sell a credit per ton. Renewable power is the next most common. So every ton of carbon dioxide emissions that's avoided because of renewable generation generates a credit. And so in countries where the grid is more polluted, so where most electricity is generated from coal or oil or natural gas, the amount of carbon reductions is actually greater. And so a wind farm in a relatively clean grid like the United Kingdom is not going to have as much impact on the carbon emissions of the grid as a wind farm in a more polluted grid somewhere like West Virginia. But these credits are typically generated in the developing world because markets like the US and the UK have renewable energy certificates, which are a separate financial instrument to carbon credits. And then we also have the emerging space of low carbon fuels, which is what Sophie will be talking about a bit more later. So every ton of emissions avoidance that is generated through the use of a synthetic or biofuel, which could be used in aviation, it could be used in road transport, it could be used in marine transport, generates a credit. And you need to demonstrate the carbon saving of your fuel when compared to the fossil alternative to demonstrate this carbon avoidance. So that's one category, avoidance. The next category is removal. And I think this is what most of us think about when we think about carbon capture and sequestration and carbon credits. So there's nature-based solutions, which today are 99% of the removals market, which itself was 22% of the total voluntary carbon credit market in 2023. So that's things like planting a tree. And so the difference between a removal and avoidance credit is avoidance is you've prevented the deforestation, you've kept the ecosystem that was already there in place, whereas a removal is planting new trees or planting new marshland areas that will capture and sequester the carbon. And you must be able to demonstrate that the carbon will be sequestered for a substantial period of time. Different verification schemes look for different durations, but typically 7 years is a minimum. And then we have the emerging area of engineered solutions. And this is the really groundbreaking, interesting stuff. This is things like direct air capture. So if you can take carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere, you can demonstrate for every ton of carbon dioxide that you've removed from the atmosphere, you then net off the amount of emissions created by that capture process. So these are very energy intensive processes. So they work really well in countries like the Nordics, where most of the electricity grid is low carbon anyway. So if you're using 100% renewable electricity to do this, the ton of captured CO2 generates 1 carbon credit. Whereas if you're in a more polluting grid, where the emissions for capture are higher, you might have to capture 1.2, 1.5 tons of carbon dioxide in order to generate a single credit, making it less revenue generating. And then the third category is reduction. And this is where I think a lot of the controversy around voluntary credits comes from. So things like energy efficiency of cook stove projects, for example, is actually quite difficult to prove. You have to collect a lot of data to say this is the carbon emissions from the cook stoves in this area before our intervention, and this is the emissions afterwards, and that's how you generate the credits. So these are typically projects in the developing world where people rely on firewood to generate heat for cooking and warmth. And a lot of these projects come in and offer things like LPG or biomass pellet cook stoves. And as part of their financial business model, they demonstrate carbon reductions and generate carbon credits. But because these are a little bit tricky to prove, that's where some of the controversy comes from about, does a credit truly represent 1 ton of emissions reduction? And this is something we'll talk about a little bit later in the buyer's guide, but it's something that any organization that's thinking about buying voluntary credits needs to think about very carefully. Other forms of reduction credit are land management. So different farming techniques allow soils to sequester more or less CO2. And so this is a good way that lots of countries use to encourage farmers to move to more sustainable agriculture practices, because it generates an additional revenue stream. And things like methane reduction. So things like municipal waste management and certain farming practices cause a lot of methane to be released to the atmosphere. And if a project can demonstrate that because of their intervention, less methane was emitted, they're able to claim carbon reduction credits